My son introduced me to his future in-laws as just some old man who used to fix airplanes or something. Everyone at the table laughed. His fiancée's mother laughed the loudest. And I sat there in my good blue blazer, the one I'd pressed myself that morning, and I said nothing. Not one word. Because I've learned something over 66 years that most people never figure out. The men who need to announce who they are usually aren't much of anybody. The ones who don't say a word are usually the ones you should be careful around. I was about to find out just how careful that room needed to be. But not yet. Not for another 20 minutes. My name is Walter Reeves. Everyone calls me Walt. I'm 66 years old. I live in a modest brick house on Wilmington Island, just outside Savannah, Georgia, the kind of house with a carport instead of a garage and a mailbox my late wife painted with little blue herons back in 2003. For most of my life, I believed that if you built something real, quietly, honestly, one decision at a time, the world would eventually notice without you having to point at it. I was wrong about one part of that. The world doesn't notice. Sometimes it takes your own son laughing at you in front of strangers before anyone in the room understands what they're actually looking at. What happened at that dinner table is a moment I will carry with me until the day I die. Not because of the humiliation, though there was plenty of that, but because of what happened 4 minutes later, when a man I had never met in my life stood up from his chair, looked my son dead in the eye, and said 9 words that changed everything. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand where I came from. I was born in 1960 in a little crossroads town outside Statesboro, Georgia, the son of a diesel mechanic and a woman who kept the books for 3 different businesses just to keep our lights on. We didn't have much. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But my father taught me how an engine breathes, how a bearing fails before it fails, how to listen to a machine the way other men listen to their wives. I joined the Army at 19 because Fort Stewart was 40 minutes from home and because the recruiter promised I'd learn to fly. He wasn't lying. I spent 6 years as a helicopter pilot, most of it flying medevac, first stateside, then 2 rotations overseas in the early 80s, and 1 deployment in 1991 during Desert Storm that I still don't talk about much, even now. I flew a UH-60 Black Hawk with the call sign Palmetto 61. I want you to remember that call sign because it matters later, more than it should have any right to. When I came home in the spring of 1991, I had $400, a bad knee, and absolutely no idea what to do with a life that wasn't built around a rotor blade. I married Diane that same August. She was a nurse at Candler Hospital, steady as a stone wall, the kind of woman who could look at a man falling apart and just quietly hand him a cup of coffee and wait until he was ready to talk. We had 1 son, Preston, born in 1995, and somewhere around 1993, using a small business loan and every ounce of mechanical knowledge my father ever gave me, I opened a 2-bay hangar out near Savannah Hilton Head International and started a little operation called Coastal Wings Aviation. Maintenance, charter work, eventually air ambulance contracts up and down the Georgia and South Carolina coast. It grew slower than a pine tree and about as steady. By 2015, we had 11 aircraft, 42 employees, and contracts with 3 regional hospital systems. In the fall of 2023, a larger aviation group out of Charlotte made me an offer for the whole operation that I genuinely did not expect to see in my lifetime. I sold it. Quietly. No press release, no interview, nothing. I want to be clear about that number, because it matters later in this story, but I'm not going to say it yet. Just know that the man in the modest brick house with the carport and the 12-year-old Ford pickup could have written a check that would have made most of that dinner table's jaws hit the floor. Nobody at that table knew that. That was intentional. That was, in fact, the whole problem. Diane passed in March of 2022, breast cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the funeral home on Bull Street. I'm not going to dress that up for you. It gutted me in a way I still haven't fully repaired and probably never will. After she was gone, I found I didn't much care about appearances anymore. I wore the same 3 flannel shirts. I kept driving the truck. I let the grass get a little long some weeks because mowing it alone felt like one more thing Diane wasn't there to comment on. I gave, quietly, to a veterans transition house in Pooler and to the nursing scholarship fund at Candler in Diane's name. And I let the rest of the money just sit there, invested, patient, doing what money is supposed to do when you're not trying to prove anything to anybody. Preston grew up different than me. I made sure of that on purpose. He never wanted for anything. Private school through 8th grade, a used but reliable car at 16, a paid-for degree in finance from the University of Georgia. He's 31 now, works for a wealth management firm downtown, wears suits that cost more than my truck's last transmission job, and somewhere along the way, I want to be honest with you, somewhere along the way my son started to be embarrassed by me. Not all at once. It came in pieces, small ones, the kind you can talk yourself out of noticing. A wince when I showed up to his office holiday party in a flannel shirt. A quiet request that I not mention Coastal Wings by name around his coworkers because it makes it sound like you're still some grease monkey dad. A birthday dinner where he introduced me to his boss as my dad. He's retired and nothing else. No pilot. No founder. No 30 years of 11 aircraft and 42 families fed. Just retired. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself a man doesn't need his own son to hand him a resume at the dinner table. I was telling myself a lot of things that spring, and most of them were lies I needed in order to keep showing up to family dinners without saying something I'd regret. Then Preston met Camille Whitfield. Camille works as a pediatric occupational therapist at Memorial Health, 29 years old, warm in a way that seemed to genuinely surprise people who'd only known my son's polished version of himself. I liked her from the first dinner. She asked me real questions. Not performance questions, real ones. What was it like flying medevac? Did I miss it? What was Diane like when she was young? She listened to the answers instead of waiting for her turn to talk, which is rarer in people her age, or frankly in people any age, than most folks want to admit. Preston proposed to her in April of this year on the Talmadge Bridge overlook with the whole Savannah skyline behind them, and I was, genuinely, happy for him. I want that on the record before anything else happens in this story, because people hear how it ends and assume I went into that summer looking for a reason to be hurt. I didn't. I went into that summer hoping, the way any father hopes, that my son had built something good and lasting, and that I'd get to sit at the head table and watch it happen. Her parents, Harold and Renata Whitfield, lived out in Ardsley Park, a beautiful old part of Savannah with live oaks, so old they've got their own historical markers. Harold ran some kind of logistics consulting firm, the details of which Preston explained to me maybe 4 separate times, because he clearly thought I should be impressed by them. Renata sat on 2 hospital foundation boards and mentioned both of them within the first 90 seconds of any conversation. They were, by every outward measure, the kind of polished, comfortable people who make other people nervous about which fork to use. And I could tell, weeks before the actual dinner, that my son was nervous about which fork I was going to use, metaphorically speaking. He started managing me. That's the only honest word for it. It started with a phone call in late June. Preston, calling on a Tuesday evening, which was already unusual because Preston mostly texted. "Hey, Dad," he said. "So, the engagement dinner. Camille's parents want to host it at the old pink house downtown. Real nice place. White tablecloths, the whole deal." "Sounds wonderful," I said. "I'll be there." There was a pause on the line I didn't love the feel of. "I was thinking," he said, "maybe we're the navy blazer. Not the tweed one. The tweed one's got the elbow patches, and it's a little, I don't know, it's a little much." "I've had that tweed jacket since 2011, I said. "It was your mother's favorite." "I know, Dad. I just want everything to go smooth, that's all. First impressions and all that." I let it go. I told myself a man picking a blazer for his son's engagement dinner is not a hill worth dying on, and it wasn't, not by itself. But then came the second call, 10 days later, and this one had teeth in it that the first one didn't. "Dad, listen, could you maybe park down the block instead of right out front? The truck's great. I love the truck, but Harold's got a Tesla and a Range Rover in that driveway, and I just don't want it to be, a whole conversation." I sat with that one for a long moment before I answered. "I want you to sit with it too, because I certainly did." My son was asking me to hide my truck. The truck I'd driven to Diane's chemo appointments 11 months straight. The truck with 208,000 honest miles on it, and not a single dent I hadn't earned. "Sure, son," I said. "I'll park down the block." And here's the part one didn't tell him, the part that sat in my chest that whole night like a stone I couldn't quite swallow or spit out. I didn't get angry, not exactly. What I felt was something closer to grief, a smaller cousin of the grief I'd felt burying Diane. Because I realized, lying awake that night, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles above our old bed, that my son had built an entire identity out of not being me. And I didn't know yet how deep that went. I had no idea it went all the way to the dinner table itself. I had no idea that in less than 2 weeks, in front of 14 people including a caterer and 2 servers, my son was going to introduce me to a room full of strangers as nothing at all. Just some old man. Not his father. Not a pilot. Not a man who built a company from a 2-bay hangar with his own 2 hands. Just some old man who used to fix airplanes or something. I want to pause here, because I know some of you listening have a Preston in your life. A grown child who somewhere along the way started editing you out of their own story, one small request at a time, until you woke up one day and realized you'd become an inconvenience they were managing instead of a father they were proud of. If that's you, stay with me, because what happened next in that restaurant is going to matter to you. The dinner was set for a Friday evening in late July, 7 o'clock, a private room at the old Pink House on Reynolds Square, the kind of restaurant with candles in real hurricane glass and a fireplace that's been burning in that same brick hearth since before the Revolutionary War. I parked, as instructed, 2 full blocks down Abercorn Street, and I walked to the restaurant in the thick Savannah heat wearing the navy blazer, the one without the elbow patches, and I want you to know I did it without complaint. I did it because I loved my son and because I wanted, more than almost anything else that summer, for this dinner to go well for him. I want to be honest with you about something else, too, because it matters for how this story lands. I wasn't wearing a suit that cost what Preston's cost. My watch was a plain steel Seiko I'd had since 1998. My shoes were good leather, but they were 15 years old and resold twice. If you'd passed me on the sidewalk that evening, you would have seen exactly what my son wanted that room to see. Just some old man. That was never an accident on my part, understand. I have never in my life needed a stranger to know what I'm worth by looking at my wrist or my shoes. That used to be a source of pride for me. That night, it very nearly cost me something I couldn't have gotten back. Harold and Renata Whitfield greeted me warmly at the door of the private room. Genuinely warmly. I want to say that clearly, because none of what happened later was Harold's doing in any unkind sense. Renata took both my hands and said she'd heard so much about me, and I remember thinking, quietly, I doubt that, given what my son had been managing about me for the last month. Camille hugged me, real and unguarded, and told me I looked handsome, and I believed her, because Camille didn't do performance. We sat, 14 of us total, family and a few close friends of the Whitfields, a business partner of Harold's named Dennis, and Dennis's wife. Wine was poured. The candles threw that soft, forgiving light that old restaurants are built around. And for about 25 minutes, it was, genuinely, a lovely evening. Then Dennis, Harold's business partner, a friendly enough man in his late 50s, turned to me somewhere around the second course and asked the question that started everything. So, Walt, he said, raising his wine glass a little, gesturing toward me. What did you do before you retired? Preston mentioned you were in aviation. And here is where I need you to understand exactly what happened, because the tone of it matters as much as the words. Preston answered before I could open my mouth. Not maliciously, I don't believe. I've turned that moment over in my head more times than I can count since, trying to find the cruelty in it, trying to decide whether he meant to wound me or whether it was simply carelessness. 31 years of quiet embarrassment finally slipping out sideways in front of an audience. I still don't fully know the answer. But I know exactly what he said, because I will hear it in my sleep for the rest of my life. Oh, Dad, he said, waving a hand, laughing a little, glancing at Camille's side of the table like he was inviting them all in on something. He's just some old man who used to fix airplanes or something. Retired now. Fixes the gutters mostly. The table laughed. I want to be precise here, because precision matters in a story like this one. Not everyone laughed. Camille didn't laugh. She looked at me, quick, apologetic, a flash of something in her eyes that told me she'd caught it too and hated it. But Renata laughed, a light, tinkling sound, the kind of laugh people give when they think they're being polite rather than cruel. Dennis chuckled and said something like, well, somebody's got to fix the gutters, and a few others joined in. Not out of malice, I don't think, just out of that easy social reflex people fall into when the loudest person at the table sets the tone. I sat there. I did not correct him. I did not say a single word about the 2-bay hangar, or the 42 employees, or the 11 aircraft, or the number that came across my desk in the fall of 2023 that I still haven't told you. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down exactly where it had been. I want you to understand something about me, because it's the whole hinge this story swings on. I have flown into weather that killed better pilots than me. I have carried men off a battlefield who were bleeding out faster than I could get the rotor up to speed. A room full of white tablecloths laughing at the word gutters was not going to be the thing that broke Walt Reeves. But something in my chest went very quiet and very still, the same stillness I used to feel right before a difficult approach, and I thought, calmly, almost gently, "All right, son. All right." That's when I noticed Harold Whitfield had gone still, too. Different kind of still than mine. He was seated 3 chairs down, and he had stopped mid-motion, his fork resting against the edge of his plate, untouched, and he was looking at me the way a man looks at something he can't quite believe he's seeing in the flesh after years of only seeing it in his memory. His eyes had gone to my left hand, specifically to the plain steel watch, and past it, just barely visible where my sleeve had ridden up when I reached for the water glass, to the edge of a faded tattoo on my forearm that I've had since 1988. A rotor blade, wrapped in a ribbon, and beneath it, 3 letters most people at that table had never had reason to ask about. PSO. Palmetto 6-1. Harold set his fork down slowly, deliberately, the way you set something down when your hands aren't entirely steady and you don't want anyone to notice. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice had changed completely, gone low and careful. "Walt, is your last name Reeves?" I looked at him. "That's right," I said. "Were you?" He started, and stopped, and I watched a grown man, a successful, composed, 60-something-year-old businessman with a Tesla in his driveway, visibly steady himself before finishing the sentence. "Were you a medevac pilot?" 1991. Call sign Palmetto. The whole table had gone quiet by then. That particular quiet that spreads through a room when people sense something has shifted beneath the surface of an ordinary evening, even before they understand what it is. I set my glass down again. "Yes, sir," I said. "That was me." And Harold Whitfield, 68 years old, a man I had never met a single day in my life until 25 minutes earlier, put both hands flat on the white tablecloth, pushed his chair back, and stood up. "I want to stop right here for a moment, because I know exactly where you are in this story, and I know exactly what you're waiting to hear. But before I tell you what Harold said, and what happened after, and what I did the next morning that I still, to this day, do not regret one single ounce of, you need to understand something about how far back this goes, and how close I came to never knowing any of it myself. So stick with me. If you're just finding this channel, welcome to Sweet Family Revenge Stories. Grab something to drink, get comfortable, because this next part is the reason you're going to want to hit that subscribe button before this video ends. And if you've been with us a while, you already know, these stories always circle back around to exactly where they need to. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from tonight, because I promise you, what happened in that dining room is only the beginning. Harold stood there for a moment with his hand braced against the back of his chair, and the whole table watched him the way you watch a man who's about to say something that's going to matter. "Preston," he said. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at my son. "You have no idea who your father is." Nobody said anything. Camille's hand had come up to her mouth. Renata was looking back and forth between her husband and me like she was trying to solve an equation with half the numbers missing. Preston, my son, sat there with his wine glass halfway to his mouth, frozen, his face doing something complicated, something between confusion and the first cold edge of dread. "Dad," he said. "What's he talking about?" Harold answered before I could, and his voice was shaking now, not with anger, with something closer to disbelief. "March of 1991, he said. Al Jubail, Saudi Arabia. I was 22 years old. Combat medic, 3rd Battalion. We took a mortar strike on a convoy about 11 kilometers out, and I had a sergeant bleeding out through a wound in his thigh that I could not get controlled no matter what I tried. And I remember looking at my watch and thinking, he's got maybe 15 minutes left in him, and there is no ground vehicle getting to us through that terrain in 15 minutes. And then I heard rotors. He stopped. He had to stop. I watched him swallow hard before he could go on. A Black Hawk came in through smoke thick enough that I genuinely did not believe a pilot could see the ground, he said. Set down in a spot I would not have called a landing zone if you'd paid me to. Pilot never got out of the seat. Just held her steady while 2 of his crew chiefs came out under fire and got my sergeant and 1 other wounded man loaded. I remember, because I was standing right at the edge of the rotor wash, looking up into that cockpit for 1/2 second before they lifted off again, and I saw the name stenciled under the window. Reeves. And I never forgot that name. Not once. Not in 34 years. Because that sergeant lived. He went home to a wife and 2 kids in Ohio because a pilot named Reeves flew into conditions no sane man flies into. The room was completely silent. Somewhere behind me, I heard one of the servers stop moving entirely, tray in hand, caught in the doorway. "I tried to find you," Harold said. And now he was looking straight at me, and there was something in his face I have not seen directed at me in a very long time. Not since the army itself. Some men gave me a coin decades ago that I still kept in a drawer at home. I tried for years. Wrote to the unit. Never got a straight answer. Records get lost. People change names, move on. I gave up eventually. Told myself it was one of those things you carry and never get to close the loop on. And then my daughter brings home a man named Reeves, and I think, small world, nice coincidence, common enough name. And then I sit across a dinner table from his father for 25 minutes. And the entire time some part of my brain keeps snagging on something I can't place. And then your son says gutters, and I finally look at your hands instead of your jacket, and there it is. Same tattoo, same watch, near enough. Same eyes, if I'm honest, same eyes I've been picturing for 34 years. He came around the table then, and he stood in front of my chair, and Harold Whitfield, 68 years old, successful, composed, put his hand out, and when I stood up and took it, he pulled me into an embrace instead, right there in front of everyone. And I felt his shoulders shaking, just slightly, just once. "You saved that man's life," he said, quiet now, just for me, though the whole table could hear it. "You saved my life too, in every way that matters, because that sergeant was my closest friend in that unit, and I do not know who I become if he dies in that sand 11 kilometers from anywhere. 34 years, Walt. 34 years I've wanted to shake the hand of the man who did that. And your own son just called you some old man who fixes gutters. I want to tell you exactly what I felt in that moment, because I promised you honesty at the start of this, and I'm going to keep that promise all the way through. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated in some sharp, satisfying way, the kind you might expect from a story like this. What I felt was much quieter and much sadder than that. I felt, for the first time and longer than I could remember, entirely seen, by a stranger, in a room full of people who were supposed to already see me and hadn't bothered to look. I sat back down slowly. The table stayed frozen for a long moment, that particular kind of silence where everyone is recalculating everything they thought they understood about the evening. Renata had gone pale. Dennis was staring at his plate like it might offer some kind of explanation. And Preston, my son, sat there with his wine glass still in his hand, forgotten, his face gone through about 4 different colors in the space of a minute. "Dad," he said, finally, his voice small in a way I hadn't heard from him since he was maybe 9 years old. "You never told me any of that." "I told you plenty," I said, and I kept my voice level, the way I've kept it level in cockpits full of smoke and boardrooms full of lawyers. "You just weren't interested in hearing it unless it came with a number attached that impressed you." Nobody laughed this time. I want to pause the story here, because there's a part of this I need to walk you through carefully, and it happened not at that table, but the following morning, in my own kitchen, over coffee that had gone cold because neither of us could bring ourselves to drink it. Preston showed up at my door at 8:15, unannounced, which he almost never does. He stood on my little brick porch with his hands jammed in his pockets, looking about as young and lost as I'd seen him look since Diane's funeral. "Can we talk?" he said. I let him in. I made a fresh pot. We sat at the same kitchen table where he'd done his homework as a boy, where Diane had once taught him long division with a deck of playing cards because he wouldn't sit still for a worksheet. And I let him talk first, because I'd already said what I needed to say the night before, standing in that private dining room, quiet and calm, while Harold Whitfield still had his hand on my shoulder. "I've spent my whole life being embarrassed by things that were never actually embarrassing," Preston said. "I'm ashamed of that, Dad. I've been ashamed of the truck. Ashamed of the flannel shirts. Ashamed that you talk about the hangar like it was just a job instead of—" He stopped, shook his head. "Instead of what it actually was. A man saving people's lives for a living and then coming home and running a company that fed 40-some families for 30 years. I built this whole version of you in my head, some small, unimpressive guy, because it was easier than admitting I never once bothered to actually ask." I let that sit for a minute before I answered. "I want to tell you something, son," I said, "and I need you to really hear it, because I'm only going to say it once. I sold Coastal Wings in the fall of 2023. I never told you the number, because you never asked me a single question about the sale beyond whether it meant I'd finally get a newer truck. The number was $11.4 million. Preston set his coffee cup down very carefully, the exact way Harold had set down his fork the night before. I have been sitting on that money for almost 2 years, I went on. Not because I don't trust you with it, but because I wanted to see what kind of man you'd become before I decided what to do with it. And last night, in front of 14 people, you told a room full of strangers that your father is just some old man who fixes gutters. I need you to understand, Preston, that a version of me existed in that room last night that had already made peace with never telling you that number at all. He looked like I'd struck him. Dad, he said. I didn't know. That's exactly the problem, I said, gently, because I wasn't trying to wound him. I was trying to finally, after 31 years, be fully honest with my own son. You didn't know because you never asked. Not about the war. Not about the company. Not about your mother's last 11 months, which you visited exactly 6 times in, because you told yourself work was more important. I let you build a small, embarrassing version of your own father in your head because it was easier than sitting with me long enough to find out the truth. And I let it happen because I loved you and I didn't want to force it. That was my mistake as much as yours. But it stops now. I want to tell you what I did in the weeks that followed, because this is the part of the story where the consequences become real, and I promised you this wasn't just a tale of humiliation, it's a story about what a man does after. I called my attorney, a woman named Judith Alvarez who has handled my affairs since the sale, and I restructured my estate plan entirely. Preston is not disinherited. I want to be clear about that, because I am not a cruel man, and he is still my son, and I love him, complicated as that love has become. But the plan I'd had in place, one that would have handed him a significant portion of that $11.4 million outright on my passing, no strings, no conditions, that plan is gone. In its place, I set up a trust that releases funds to him incrementally, tied to nothing extravagant, just simple, human milestones, and administered by Judith rather than handed over in a lump sum to a man who, at 31, still hadn't learned to ask his own father a single real question. And I did something else, something that I think matters more than any of the financial restructuring, something I want every one of you listening to really sit with, because this is the sweet part of the story, the part one promised you at the start. There is a man named Ruben Castillo who worked for me at Coastal Wings for 19 years, starting as a 19-year-old apprentice mechanic in 2004 and rising to become my chief of maintenance by the time we sold the company. Ruben drove 90 minutes round trip to sit with Diane in the hospital during her last month, on his own time, because he said she used to bring him sandwiches from home when he was a young apprentice too broke to afford lunch, and he never forgot it. Ruben has 3 kids, the oldest starting community college this fall with dreams of an aviation maintenance degree he's been quietly saving toward on a mechanic's salary. When I restructured that trust with Judith, I did something Preston does not yet know about, though he will, because I intend to tell him myself, face to face, the way a man should. I established a scholarship fund in Diane's name at Savannah Technical College's aviation maintenance program, and the first full 4-year scholarship went to Ruben Castillo's oldest daughter, Marisol, 19 years old, who found out on a Tuesday afternoon in August and called me crying so hard I could barely understand her, saying thank you, Mr. Reeves, thank you, over and over, until her father took the phone from her and simply said, Walt, and couldn't get anything else out either. That's the kind of gratitude I'd been missing, without even realizing how much I'd been missing it, for longer than I want to admit. As for Harold Whitfield, I want to tell you what happened there too, because it's the part of this story that still, even now, catches in my throat a little when I think about it. 2 weeks after that dinner, Harold called and asked if I'd come to his house, just the 2 of us, no dinner, no audience. I drove over on a Sunday afternoon, and he met me on his front porch with 2 glasses of sweet tea and a small wooden box he set on the table between our chairs. Inside it was a single military coin, tarnished with age, and a photograph, creased and faded, of a young sergeant, healthy, smiling, standing beside a wife and 2 small children. That's Sergeant Danny Ruiz, Harold said. The man you carried out of that sand in 1991. He passed in 2019, natural causes, 71 years old, surrounded by his grandkids. He got 28 more years, Walt. Because of what you did in about 90 seconds one afternoon you probably don't even remember the exact date of. I do remember the date, I told him. March the 14th. I remember every extraction I ever flew. You don't forget the ones where the outcome could have gone the other way so easily. Harold nodded slowly, and we sat on that porch for a long while, not saying much else. Just two old men who'd finally found each other after 34 years, watching the afternoon light move slow across his lawn. Camille and Preston's wedding is set for next April, down at a plantation venue outside Savannah, and I'll be there, in the front row, and I imagine I'll wear the tweed jacket with the elbow patches, because it was Diane's favorite, and because I don't manage myself for anyone's comfort anymore. Preston and I talk now, actually talk, most weeks, and it's slow, and it's a little clumsy sometimes, the way it is when two people are learning a new language late in life. He asked me, just last month, sitting on my porch with 2 beers between us, what it actually felt like, flying into that kind of smoke, not knowing what was waiting on the other side of it. And I told him the truth. I told him it felt like the only thing in the world that mattered was getting to the person who needed you, and that everything else, the fear, the noise, the not knowing, all of it just goes quiet when you finally understand what you're there to do. I think about that a lot now, in a different context entirely. Because I spent 31 years quietly getting to my son, in every way I knew how, paying for things, showing up, staying steady, and somewhere along the way he stopped being able to see me doing it. It took a stranger standing up from a dinner table, a man I hadn't seen in 34 years, to remind both of us what was actually there the whole time, underneath the flannel shirts and the old truck and the watch that never needed to be expensive to keep good time. I don't regret restructuring that trust. I don't regret a single dollar that went to Marisol Castillo instead of sitting untouched in an account for a son who once needed a stranger to explain to him who his own father was. But I want to end this the way I think it deserves to be ended, because this isn't really a story about money, or about humiliation, or even about revenge, not in the way some of you might have expected walking into this video. It's a story about the difference between being introduced and being known. My son introduced me for 31 years. It took a man named Harold Whitfield exactly 90 seconds to actually know me, because he'd spent 34 years carrying the truth of who I was, waiting for the chance to say it out loud. I hope, for every one of you listening tonight, that somebody in your life is doing the same for you, quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to stand up and remind the room exactly who you really are. And if nobody has yet, I hope you find the strength, the way I finally did, to stop shrinking yourself down to fit the smallest version anybody's ever handed you. If this story meant something to you tonight, I'd ask you for 2 small things before you go. Hit that like button, because it tells this channel that stories like mine deserve to keep reaching people who need them. And drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because I read every single one, and it means more to an old man than you probably know. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you. And to whoever out there feels like just some old man tonight, I promise you, somebody out there already knows exactly who you are. Give them the chance to say it. I will see you on the next one. Word count, 5148.